Alright, this is key position number 5. It's black to move and win in 25. It's only taking 2 moves to reach key position number 4, but there's going to be a lot of sub-variations, so it's a lot more complicated than the previous key positions. So the first thing to note is that black can't play knight to c3. This is pretty much the same kind of attacking formation that black has in key position number 4, but a big difference here is that white can draw by overtaking the second rank with this stalemate trick, and white can also delay overtaking the second rank. So if king to b3, there's an instant draw with rook to b4 check, so rook b2 check there, and then there's an instant draw there. So king to b5 would be forced, and then white can play rook to g2 now, or rook to g5 check, but rook to b4 would allow black to exploit control over b5 and a4. So after rook to g5, white has to play rook to g2 now, so it was better to do it the move before, because now if rook to g4 check, then black wins by exploiting control of a4. So white has this drawing idea with rook to g2.
Okay, with white's rook on f1, black can go ahead and stalemate white with knight c3, since if white plays rook f2, then black has the fork knight d1 check. So in other variations, black can exploit the control of b5 and a4, so there's no way for white to become a desperado. So after king b5, now rook f5 is answered with king b4, and then black escapes, and white has no more checks here, and white can try rook to b4 check, but white is out of checks immediately here.
So white to move here is a draw with rook to g2 or rook to g4 check first. Black is going to be winning if white's rook is on the f-file instead because of the fork trick, but white's rook is safe from a fork here, so the position is a draw. It's a big difference with white's rook being able to overtake the second rank. It would be like key position number 4. If white's rook was down here, then there'd be no way to overtake the second rank because this would just block white's king. So black would win like in key position number 4 with white's rook down here. But with white's rook up here, black can't immediately play into this aggressive attacking formation. So with white's rook on f1, black would be able to play knight to c3, but here black can't immediately play this, and white has drawing ideas like if it was white's move here, rook to g3 would stop black's king from getting an aggressive post, and then if knight to c3, then white can draw with rook g2 or rook to g4 check first. So rook to g3 is one idea, and also causing black's rook to become misplaced here. Now black's rook wishes it had easy access to the A file, so this is something else that black needs to prepare for.
Black can't invade with knight to c3, and black can't invade with king to b3 either, because there's not going to be any way for black's king to achieve a more active post than the c4 square. So check, and the problem is that black's king can't post itself on any square that's stronger than c4, because if king c2, then rook c1 check, and there's the stalemate trick here, so black doesn't have anything but returning to the c4 square. And if king to a3, then this is a first back block formation, which is a draw because white's king can take advantage of stalemate. Black's not going to be able to win the same way that the second back block formation is won. So if black tries to take the best square from white's rook, it doesn't really do anything because it's just going to be stalemate if black captures this rook. So there's no way for black to win here. And this b8 square is just too strong for white's rook, and black doesn't really have any other winning ideas because white can also plan to escape to the c file, and the rook also controls where black's king can get more active, and if black tries something like this, there's just going to be immediate stalemate trick. So black can't post the king on a3, and black can't post the king on c2 either, and c3 is not really going to do anything because the rook can still check it away. So because of the stalemate tricks with white's rook, black can't invade with king to b3, and black can't invade with knight to c3 either. So the main problem is that this a2 square is controlled by black's rook, and it's okay for black's rook to abandon control of a2 because the knight can attack it with tempo if white's king tries to escape with king a2. So black's rook is going to retreat to one of the 4 bottom ranks, so it'll have efficient access to the a file and the lines where that's needed.
Alright, so any of these 4 rook moves are going to preserve the win, but as we'll see later, rook h5 is the accurate move. If black tries rook to h3 or rook to h4, then white's going to be able to exploit it. So if rook to h4, this places the rook where it's not very complementary to its king. So white can exploit this with king to a2, and now this knight check with tempo doesn't matter because black's not in a position to check along the a file where black could then get a skewer along the first rank. So notice that if black's rook was on h3 instead of h4, then black would have this discovered attack winning the rook. So this wouldn't work against rook to h3. So instead of rook to h4, if rook to h3, then white can refute this with rook to g7 specifically. This is going to avoid a future skewer on the b file. So after king to b3, rook to b7 check is forced, because if rook to g1, then knight to c3, and then there's going to be a quick checkmate with this rook. So rook to b7 check, and then note that this refutation wouldn't work with white's rook on b8 or with black's rook on h4, because after king to a2, this would be a checkmate if black's rook was on h4, but here all black has is a discovered attack, and black can try to win the rook with check, which is going to lead to a skewer on the b file if white plays king to b4, but after king to a4, white gets a step closer to the rook, and white's able to hold on to the rook. So white has to play rook to g7 specifically when refuting rook to h3. So rook to g7 draws here. This would be a blunder. If white plays the instinctual move rook to g8, then white's going to fall into a skewer along the b file where white's king is not going to be able to catch his rook to defend it. So here the correct move is knight to b1 check, which gets the knight out of the way of the b file for when the skewer occurs. A blunder for black would be knight to b5 check. This controls a3 just like knight to b1, but it has the problem of putting the knight where it blocks the b file. So in this case, there's no skewer here. After rook to b3 check, white avoids all tactics with king to c5 or king to a5. So king to c5 is the most natural move. And it would be a blunder if white played king to c4 or king to a4 because the knight can access those squares easily. So this position is a draw with black's knight on b5, but black would win if this knight was on b6, as we'll see in another subvariation. Alright, so black's only moves to make progress are one of these four rook moves that leave a clear path to the a file. We saw that rook to h3 is refuted with rook to g7, and rook to h4 is refuted with king to a2.
The correct move for black is rook to h5, because in the variation rook to g3, preventing black from playing king to b3, black has to block so that now the king is free to go to b3, and white can try to stop this with rook to g8, but black can now intercept the rook's path by exploiting control over the b5 square. But note that even if the rook didn't support the knight on b5, black could still win with king to c2, and this would reach key position number 4 like this. Now this is key position number 4, or it could reach a kind of mirror image of key position number 4 like this, and now this skewer attempt would fail because it's stalemate, so black would play this, and then this is just kind of mirror image of key position number 4. So since a win is a win, it really doesn't matter which of these rook moves black does, but the most precise move is rook to h5. This forces a win the fastest because it prevents rook g3. And if white's king tries to escape, then black can check on the second rank. White can try rook g2, but this would just lead to the mirror image of key position number 4 with rook to b5, and now this is a mirror image of key position number 4, but black can win faster. Black has this skewer which looks like the recurring stalemate theme, since black can't capture the rook, but there's two reasons why black wins here. One is that this rook is placed where it's not going to be able to check on the third rank after black checks with the knight, and also because this king is not immediately in its checkmating location, black can answer king d1 with king to b3, but with a king on d3 instead, this position would be a draw because either black's rook has to move or black has to repeat positions with knight c3 check. So, but here black is winning very. The knight controls c1, and there's no way that white can stop rook to d2 and then rook to d1 mate. And if this rook ever moves off the second rank, then black's gonna have knight c3 check. So white's only other move is king d1, and then black follows the king and try to escape to f2, but black's king can cover that, and now it's going to be rook a1 mate, so white can try to escape to c2 if rook a1, but black can still cover the c2 square, and at the same time black threatens mate on a square where the knight defends and also will be covering c2. So there's no way that white can escape this position. We call it the diamond formation because the pieces are arranged in this kind of diamond shape here. So okay, so we know that rook to g3 is not the best move, and if white's king tries to escape, then black's knight will be able to take advantage of the fact that it can jump to c3 with tempo, and the c1 square is also indirectly restricted by the idea of a fork coming from e2. So there's really no way for white's king to escape here. Knight also covers b2, so black's going to achieve either a fork on e2 or a mating net or a skewer on the first rank if white's king tries to escape. So king b1, knight check, and king c2, then white's king is forced onto the forkable c1 square. King to a2 here, king a3, there's still going to be a skewer on the first rank, so it's not that hard to see that any escape attempt by white's king is going to either lead to a mating net or a skewer on the first rank or a fork on the e2 square. So moving the king is off limits for white, and we saw that rook to g3 is not good. So white's other choices are rook to g7 and rook to g8 are going to lead to the same thing as rook to c1 check. White's best move here is rook to b1, which controls b3, and even though black's knight can come to c3 with tempo, the rook can maintain control of b3, but this is key position number 4, so white's best move is to play into key position number 4, and any other variation is going to lead to a quicker win for black, where black doesn't have to play through all those key positions. So the only variations left to look at are the ones where black's king is able to post itself on one of these strong squares, and when the king's on b3, it's going to have to be driven to c2 because black's going to be threatening knight c3 and also have ideas of mating on the first rank, so black's king is going to have to be on c2, and no matter where white's pieces end up, there's going to be a way for black to win. So I think it's easier to explain this if I just set the position up with just the kings and the knight on the board. So now, king to b3, white is going to have to check with the rook, and the check is going to occur from the b file since the knight is able to block on c3 against a rook check coming from the third rank, and the knight blocks a check that could come to b2 from the second rank. So the position of white's rook after king to b3 is either going to be on b1, b7, or b8. So white's rook is going to be on one of these green squares, and we already know that it's going to be a draw of king a3. So after king to c2, white's rook is going to be on one of these green squares. Remember, black's rook is on h5, and it's going to be threatening to play rook a5, in which this would be a decisive threat. So white has two ways to try to stop rook a5. One of them is to try to escape with the king, and the other way is to try for a check on the g2 square, which would be played for with rook to g1, rook to g7, or rook to g8, depending on where white's rook comes from. And before we look at the lines where white's rook returns to the g file, let's look at what happens if white's king attempts to escape with white's rook still on the b file. So black's rook would still be on h5, and white's rook would be on one of the b file squares, and it's obvious it can't be on b1 because of the knight fork. So white's rook would be on b7 or b8, and the rook also can't be on b7 because black can go ahead and play rook a5, and it doesn't matter that white's king can escape because black has this discovered check that would win a rook on b7 and also defend its own rook on a5. So the rook can't be on b7 either. With white's rook on b8, this won't work because there won't be a discovered check. Black only has one winning move here, and that's to offer the knight on b6. This takes advantage of the placement of white's rook. So now white can't check on c8, and white can't check on b2 either. So since black is threatening mate also, there's nothing that white's rook can do. White's king has to make an attempt to escape here. And now with rook to h3 check, and if king a2, then just rook h4 followed by checkmate here. So king to b4, and now black wins the rook with a discovered check. And if you notice that this is similar to a sub-variation that we already went over, where the knight was on b5 and white had a draw here by escaping to c5 or a5, but with the knight on b5, white could escape, but with the knight on b6, white doesn't have any move that's not going to allow the knight to check. So black is able to check on c5, and the knight can also reach a5 in one move, but there's going to be a stalemate if black attempts to take the rook immediately, but black has this knight check first and then captures the rook. So black's winning very quickly in this variation. So we know that king to a2 is not going to work with white's rook on the b file. White is going to have to move the rook to the g file and leave the king in the corner. So now white threatens rook to g2 check if black attempts rook to a5. And the refutation of rook to a5 is only going to work with white's rook on the g file. This variation is a draw because black's rook is poorly placed on a5, so white's king can escape here. And the reason that white's rook needs to be on the g file is to avoid a fork that would occur if white's rook was on f2 instead. But in this position, there's no way for black to win because this is just the recurring stalemate theme, and black's king is not placed to follow white's king in the diamond formation. So this is a draw with black's king too slow. And one thing to note about this position is that black could just play into key position number 4, and then no matter which green square white's rook is on, it's just going to lead to either key position number 4 or a mirror image of it. But black has a faster way to win. Remember that this king is completely safe on c2 because the check on the second rank won't work. So all black would have to do is keep white's king entombed over here, and then find a way that knight to c3 can be played, and then block a check on the e2 square. So the idea would be to bring the rook to the e file to control e2, but the problem is that white is threatening to escape like this, and so black would have to do something about the b4 square. Black moves the rook onto h4, so now b4 and a4 are controlled, and since the knight can attack a2 with tempo, this is off limits since the rook can come to a4 with mate immediately when white plays king a3. So this king is entombed here, and this rook g2 check still isn't safe. So all black would have to do next is bring the rook to e4 and then control e2 with the knight. where it's supported by rook on e4. The knight c3 idea would be safe if white's rook is somewhere on this area of the board, but with white's rook over here on the b file, knight c3 won't be safe because white will have rook to b2 check. So white's rook is going to be on one of the green squares, and black's rook is on e4, and there's going to be a way for black to take advantage of any of these placements on the b file, and if the rook returns to this area of the board, then black's going to have knight c3 and the knight e2 block. So with the rook on b1, there's the idea of a fork, so the rook would have to either move down the b file or return here. With white's rook on b5, black would have rook to e1 check, and then a fork knight to c3, so b5 is also off limits. With white's rook on b7, remember the knight can attack it, which would be dangerous if black's rook was on the a file, so if white's rook is on b7, all black has to do is maneuver the rook to the a file with one of these moves, and then since this will be a discovered check, it doesn't matter that white's king can escape. And if white's rook returns, then even if black's rook is on e5, e6, or e8, it's still going to be controlling e2, so black can still win like this. So b7 is also off limits. With white's rook on b8, remember black has this knight sacrifice, but this time it's not the only winning move since white's king isn't threatening to escape, but this is the fastest winning move. So that's pretty much it for key position number 5. So let's do a quick review.
Alright, so black can't invade with king to b3, and black can't invade with knight to c3 either. The problem is that this rook controls a2, which leads to a lot of stalemate problems. Black's best moves are moves that have a clear path to the a file and where it's not going to get in the way of black's other pieces on the third or fourth rank. So the most accurate move is rook to h5, which prepares for the subvariation rook to g3, in which the knight can come to c3 and then block on b5 against a rook check on the b file. So black's king wouldn't have to go to c2 in that variation. So after rook to h5, white's best move is to play into key position number 4 with rook to b1, keeping control of b3. Other alternatives for white are going to lose a lot more quickly. Knight can come to c3 with tempo, with some decisive tactics if white's king tries to escape, and if white's rook tries to stop king to b3, then black can post the king on c2, and this rook is ready for decisive tactics along the a file, in which black is going to be able to exploit the placement of this rook on the b file no matter where it is, like we already went over. So in this case, knight to b6 would be the correct refutation. So the rook would come to the other side to aim for checks over here, but white's kind of immobilized right now because black would safely post the king on b3. So all black has to do is secure this area and prevent white's king from escaping, and then eventually get the rook to the e file where this knight can block on e2. So there's white can't escape down here because of the quick checkmate. So white's still kind of paralyzed, and there's nothing stopping black from getting in knight to c3 where the knight can block on e2, and also exploiting any placement of the rook on the b file. So any variation where black's king gets aggressively posted on b3 or c2 is going to be a quicker win. The correct move for white is rook to b1, which reaches key position number 4. After knight to c3, and rook to b7 or b8, and then rook to h2, avoiding the refuted skewer. And instead of knight to c3, if black tries king to c3, then white can exploit this with king to a2, and black doesn't have a decisive. Alright, so the main idea is that white's rook starts out in a good location to be a desperado, but after rook to h5, white has to stop king to b3 from a place that can't be blocked. Now this puts white's rook in a bad location to be a desperado, so in key position number 4, black can go ahead and stalemate white. Black moved his rook back and forth, but by threatening to get a good location on the A file and by eliminating the stalemate tension, white's rook was forced into a location where it's going to be a bad desperado. So black is going to be able to escape the threats. White can force black's knight away from this aggressive post, but black can later force a second BBF in which there's not going to be any way for white to exploit any stalemate ideas. Now, unlike the first BBF, there's no stalemate idea here.